The Colloquy series on Stanford's Arcade website brings together intellectual work in different modes, for example, book chapters, recorded lectures, journal articles, and blog posts, on a common theme, organized and introduced by curators. After Scansion is a part of a colloquy organized by Natalie Gerber and Eric Weiscott entitled Prosody, Alternative Histories. I'm Marit MacArthur.
And I'm Lee Miller.
I'm an English professor and a poet.
And I'm a neuroscientist. I study speech perception.
In this short podcast, we want to jog your memory about Scansion and suggest some alternatives for thinking about prosody and poetry. After listening, we hope you'll explore our longer piece and play with some of the tools and examples we share.
What's Scansion again? Remind me?
You probably remember it from English class. Let's say I'm the teacher and I write a poem on the whiteboard, like The Lake Isle of Innisfree by William Butler Yeats. And then I or a brave student or two read it aloud. Then everyone would read the poem again in silence, and you'd start to identify the formal patterns. Notice that it's written in quatrains, and you'd count syllables. Maybe you'd chew on a pencil, mutter a line or two out loud.
And I shall have some peace there, for peace comes dropping slow.
And then you'd break up lines into feet, marking where the stresses or accents should fall. That's Scansion. You'd use this binary symbolic system that vastly oversimplifies the prosody of spoken English.
Oh, right, with giant pseudo-diacritical marks over stressed syllables. They look like the acute accent and the breve, but bigger. And a forward slash for dividing poetic feet, and two parallel lines for caesuras or pauses within a line.
Yep, that's right. Then, for a while, we'd discuss the poem's speaker. A disaffected urbanite, probably. The natural imagery and lilting word choice. A cozy cabin, the bees and the beans, the lapping lake, the sounds of crickets and linnets, and the syntax with some reinforcing parallelism and repetition, and the tone resolute yet wistful. And then, as a class, we'd take on the form of the poem together. We'd apply those terms developed for ancient Greek verse to Yeats's poem in English. We might agree, maybe with mild hectoring from a few students, that each quatrain begins with 3 long lines of loosely iambic hexameter and ends with a shorter line of iambic tetrameter.
Hey, but only one of the long lines has 14 syllables. Most of them have 13, one has 15, and only the last line of the poem has 8 syllables. The 2 other short lines have 9.
Right, that's a problem. So we'd say that Yeats substitutes trochees, anapests, and dactyls for iambs here and there.
Da-da, 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 da-da. That's what iambic sounds like, right?
Right, and that's not how The Lake Isle of Innisfree, or most ostensibly iambic poems, sound to us. The metrical expectation would approximate the regularity of a metronome, but the meter is not the rhythm. So, as the teacher, I'd try to lead the class towards some consensus about how the stress patterns actually fall. And ideally, the interplay between metrical expectations and the apparent rhythms of the poem would test and reinforce various interpretations.
Okay, so Yeats's speaker is resolute, determined to escape this unsatisfactory locale. I will arise and go, he declares iambically.
Good. On that interpretation of the opening line, if we place the stresses as you did, the metrical expectation would coincide with the emphatic iambic rhythm, reinforcing the speaker's ardent wish.
And maybe someone else would say that the closing quatrain, which shifts into the present tense as the wish becomes imaginative reality, ends with 3 stressed syllables, deep heart's core, against the iambic expectation. That emphasizes how real the dream is to the speaker, how powerful his vision of escape.
Plausible enough. But why not the deep heart's core, if you're more convinced by an iambic rhythm? Alas, after such a class, some students usually decide that they're bad at Scansion, and that therefore they can't really appreciate poetry.
And after that class, other students might quite reasonably decide that the problem lies in Scansion, not in their allegedly defective sensibilities. They might, if not in so many words, argue that it has some serious limitations as a useful heuristic for the study of poetry, which, as our teacher keeps saying, has been primarily in oral form for most of history. Writing is a recent kludge, an add-on, not a deep, inevitable function of the human brain like speech. And oversimplifying speech patterns, as Scansion does, can oversimplify the way that we read and hear a poem.
Exactly. In our hypothetical class just now, we've really started to talk about the speaker's tone. But why determine his tone from the words and from a silent, simplified rhythm? Different tones of voice, after all, drastically affect semantics.
Like if I say, I'm just fine, or I'm just fine. In the second example, you know I'm lying through my teeth, just from the tone of my voice.
Right. Now, what if we actually listen to Yeats a little bit? Let's say our teacher played a recording of him at the end of class.
I will arise and go now and go to Innisfree, and a small cabin build there of clay and wattles made.
What? That's crazy. Why does he read it like that, in a near monotone? Is he trying to put us to sleep or enchant us with his fantasy?
Good questions. What if we want to capture the difference between our scansion of the poem on the page and Yeats's intonation patterns when he reads it? If we consider the stress and pitch of his reading separately, we discover that Yeats's near monotone pitch patterns work against the stress he gives to accented syllables by increasing intensity or volume. He's deliberately flattening his pitch, avoiding contrastive intonation.
Right. One thing this example shows, and helps us here, is that pitch and intensity are two independent acoustic qualities. Scansion tries to capture the imagined intensity patterns, but it basically ignores pitch. We modulate pitch independently from intensity for the purposes of expression. And when people talk, human listeners pay a lot of attention to the changes in pitch.
So let's listen to what Yeats sounds like with his pitch and intensity patterns more closely aligned.
I will arise and go now and go to Innisfree, and a small cabin build there of clay and wattles made.
So how do we think this version changes our perception of the speaker's tone? To me, the speaker suddenly sounds more determined, like he's ready to hike out of town immediately, instead of trying to enchant the reader to join in his fantasy with a kind of incantatory tone. That's just one example of how changing the intonation patterns, but preserving the poet's other vocal qualities, can help us recognize the importance of pitch patterns in the performance and interpretation of poetry. At the same time, these changes in pitch can help us imagine different interpretations.
To change Yeats's pitch here, we used an open-source speech synthesis program called Tandem Straight, developed by Hideki Kawahara. It's one of several tools we use to attune our ears to the nuances of poetic prosody in performance. Tandem Straight can also allow us to turn a confident, declarative tone into a questioning one by simply inverting a speaker's intonation pattern. Let's listen to the original and manipulated version of T.S. Eliot reading a few lines from the 5th section of The Wasteland.
The awful daring of a moment's surrender, which an age of prudence can never retract. By this and this only, we have existed. The awful daring of a moment's surrender, which an age of prudence can never retract. By this and this only, we have existed.
Of course, it's fun to make Eliot use uptuck, but I think it's not only fun. Because the second version sounds more speculative, I feel invited by the speaker to consider whether such moments do define our existence or not, even to challenge him on that point. The wasteland so often feels like a closed case, and this opens it up again. Something else we can manipulate is the size of a poet's vocal tract, along with pitch range, to make a biologically male poet sound female and vice versa. Does Eliot's authoritative tone remain intact when we turn him into a woman? Listen.
The awful daring of a moment's surrender, which an age of prudence can never retract. By this and this only, we have existed.
For me, a manipulation like that can dramatize questions about poetry and performance, and about speech perception that sometimes feel theoretical or a little abstract.
For instance, do we ascribe more authority to male poets than to female poets? Or to male speakers in general? Or to any human speaker with lower average pitch?
We might not want to think we do, but when we laugh at a female Eliot, is it just because we're used to hearing him as male? Or are we also laughing at the idea of taking an elderly woman's tremulous voice seriously as a voice of poetic authority?
We call this sort of manipulation vocal deformance, which is very common in experimental and pop music production, from Laurie Anderson to Justin Bieber. But aside from the work of some experimental poets, vocal deformance has not been applied much to poetry recordings or the teaching of poetry. And there's a lot we can learn from it. On the page, we might say that a poem is underdetermined because its various oral potentials, and thus interpretations, aren't realized.
And even though without deformance, we can listen to multiple performances of the same poem and perform it in different ways ourselves, it can be difficult to break out of our own habitual speaking patterns. or to find different recordings of the same poet reading with drastically different intonation patterns, much less as a different gender.
These few deformances should remind us that poetry is, after all, stylized communication. It calls on deep neural pathways established in the human brain long ago in evolutionary terms. These old pathways support the complex perception of language as speech, and as gesture in the case of signed languages, but not language as written. We can't ignore the complexity of prosody as heard if we really want to understand the audible experience of poetry. And from a biobehavioral perspective, scansion as inferred from the written text is just a very inapt tool for poetic interpretation. The brain is something like a tremendously complex statistical prediction machine. We're programmed from birth to test our expectations, seeking experiences, in this case, seeking prosodic patterns that are neither too predictable nor too surprising. In cognitive neuroscience, this is known as the Goldilocks effect. Think about the interplay between our expectations and Yeats's performance of the Lake Isle of Innisfree. We listen for patterns and deviation from patterns, or expectations met or resisted.
And I'd say we also form expectations for how a poet will sound based on the little we know or assume about their identities, and about how we think poetry should sound based on our previous experiences of hearing poetry read or performed.
Right. We listen for repetition and change, in the moment and based on previous experiences. Our brains are continuously, unconsciously tracking and predicting the timing of sound across multiple dimensions, including frequency or pitch, intensity, duration, silent gaps or pauses. Even without paying conscious attention, our brains know within a fraction of a second when an acoustic prediction was violated. These are precisely the features that distinguish the prosody of one poem from another, or one performance from another of the same poem, or one poet's prosodic style from another's.
So how did we get in the habit of ignoring pitch in poetry and of oversimplifying poetic prosody? Why try to assess rhythm on the page instead of as performed? What if scansion had never become dominant? And how do different disciplines approach the study of prosody? In the longer piece that accompanies this podcast, we try to answer these questions and introduce tools that you can use to explore them yourselves. And we hope you have fun with it.